Hey, friends. This is Pastor Jack Mantrick from Central United Methodist Church right here in Waterford, Michigan. And this is my daily devotion for today, Wednesday, March 10th. Can you believe we're 10 days into March already? Really coming into the middle of this season of Lent when we are considering on our Sunday morning messages words that were spoken to the cross or near the cross as Jesus were dying on that hill called Golgotha. Friends, we've been talking about these words. We've been talking about the words, and the word for today comes from the four guards that were overseeing the execution of Christ. Their compensation for such a horrible task was the ability to divide up the executed person's clothing. So they divided up the four pieces of clothing that were there for Jesus, and then there was a fifth piece, the tunic, and they decided, let's not tear it. So that's the word to the cross. Let's not tear it. They didn't want to destroy this fine piece of clothing, tearing it, ripping it into four worthless pieces of cloth, but rather maintain its integrity, its value. After all, it represented probably 3 days, maybe a full week's salary. So they wanted to maintain the integrity of that cloth, and so they gambled for it. They casted lots, and to remember then that there were four women there that were looking onto the cross. Also, Mary, Jesus's mother, her sister Salome, another Mary, the wife of Clopas. We're not quite sure who she was, but then and then there's Mary Magdala, and they were there with the disciple, at least the disciple John. And yesterday we considered, well, do you think there was any interaction between the women and John and the guards? Dr. J. Ellis Callis was a Bible scholar from Asbury Seminary, and he asked the question. He writes, I wonder why they didn't give the garment to Jesus' mother. And he concludes that they were practical men. They were just making sure that each man got his share and that the tunic retained its value. After all, as I've said, the garment was rather valuable. I think the soldiers were there to do a task that was so horrific on so many levels that their walls of indifference led them through thoughtless actions. They just kept their head down and their hearts were steeled against any type of kindness that they might show to the women or to John. So often when our words and actions hurt others, it's not because we're horrible, just terrible people. It's because we're not thinking. We're often thoughtless when we do such things. Literally, we are without thought. Often we might hear somebody say, or we might say ourselves, I'm so sorry, I just wasn't thinking. Much of the time, our insensitivity is the result of being too busy or preoccupied. We can tell ourselves, friends, that we are so different from the world and so different from the soldiers and the time in which they put Jesus to death. But let me ask you some questions. Have you ever been so busy that you told your child, hey, I don't have time to hear your story or your big news? Or have you ever planned a dinner party for your friends while a neighbor is suffering from loneliness and lack of friendship? Have you ever walked by somebody, asked them how they're doing, and they say, really crappy, and you say, all right, see you later, not really listening to their concerns. So often when our words and actions hurts others, we're just not thinking. So I want to ask you, can you see how your words and actions might be words of indifference caused by your busyness or your preoccupation? I think it's sometimes a coping mechanism. It's a coping mechanism against the difficulties in our world. I just recently heard an explanation that sometimes the malaise in our world is caused because we're in a 24-hour news cycle. We hear bad news all day long, not just for an hour with the 6 o'clock evening news. We hear about it all day long. So I want you to think about, friends, how do we cope better with the terrible things that happen around us. But not only that, how do we move from indifference? How do we move from being busy? How do we move from being preoccupied so that we can meet the needs of our world in ways that reflect the love of God and the love of Christ? Think about this. Have a great Wednesday. We'll talk to you tomorrow.